Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to welcome you all here tonight for our speaker series presentation. I have a few remarks to make. First, I'd like to tell you a little bit about Storm Surge, which is the sponsor of the speaker series. Storm Surge was formed in 2013 after a very severe storm hit this area, especially Plum Island. 6 houses fell into the water, washed the beach away, they fell in the water, and about 7 were declared unfit to be inhabited. Another 24 or so were in areas that the next flood event would probably get them. So the owners, I think that's it, I'm done. Yeah. Okay. Click. Okay, good. The Storm Surge group was formed then in 2013. I came along a little later and have been in the group now for about 8, I never can remember exactly when, but 8 or 9 years. And I've seen it grow in the speaker series and the kind of speakers we invite, much like the speakers that are going to be here tonight. We try to present only science-based knowledge about the effects of climate change, sea level rise, frequency and intensity of storms, things of that sort. And it's try to gear it toward what's could happen or would happen here in Newburyport if it hasn't already happened because of one of those things, like the big storm. It was a northeaster, perfect conditions out there. We're trying to develop more outreach to schools, younger kids, high school down through the grade school, and we'll say a little more about that later. But tonight, we're delighted to welcome our speakers, Liv Woods, and who is Executive Director of the Massachusetts Oyster Project, and Dr. John, and forgive me, Sigliano?
Perfect.
Ooh, good. They'll give us a comprehensive look at how oysters are helping to fight coastal acidification. The water is getting more acidy. And they are helping to fight coastal acidification. Boy, can't say it twice, can I? Liv will spotlight how oyster cultivation and shell recycling programs improve water quality and biodiversity while creating resilient coastal ecosystems. And John will explain the science of ocean acidification and its effects on the Gulf of Maine, emphasizing the official and critical role oysters play in nature's reef builders. So, I've told you these kind of things about the formation of Storm Surge. But the other thing that I'd like to make you aware of is that these are all recorded, and by the same video station, the city video station here, and we make them available to the general public through our website. So anything that's been recorded from a speaker series in this room is available through our website. Click on the link and the website will play it back for you. So there are many other topics that have been covered. So, we're also lucky to have with us tonight representatives from local businesses in our community, which I'm going to name Greenhouse Goods, Long Wharf Supply Company, which is actually based in Boston, and well, how could I forget this? I eat there frequently. The Sea Level Oyster House. Why couldn't I think of that? In any case, let me carry on here. The storm surge exists because of people like you and me, anybody who volunteers here. And the reason that's so important is going to be shown to you tonight in the idea that somebody could organize these kind of presentations that we could all learn from. So I want to thank all of you who support Storm Surge, either by volunteering or donations. We appreciate that. We are a 501c3 organization, a nonprofit, and we can look forward to seeing more of these kind of things in the next two speakers that will be here. They'll be followed by one in April by Phil Colarusso, who is he'll share updates on a presentation he gave earlier 2 years ago, I think now, and he will be talking about seagrass meadows and woodlands and the life in them, followed by one in January, a presentation of total tidal predictability and flood forecasting. And this is where I really get in trouble in the pronunciation, from Katie Gananopoulos. And excuse me, Katie, if I've mispronounced it. From the Coastal Dynamics Research Associates in the Gulf of Maine Research Institute. So tonight, as I said, we're going to hear the talk given by Liz Woods, who's the executive director at the Massachusetts Oyster Project, and by Dr. John Sigliano, who is a marine conservation scientist and a member of the MOP Board of Directors. He wears a couple of other hats, a few other hats, a lot of other hats. And Liz is really helping launch the Massachusetts Oyster Project. So, I'd like to, I've already thanked some of these, but I also want to put a plug in for Storm Surge itself, because I do want to mention that we are rebuilding. We are very anxious to have more volunteers because we are trying to expand our scope of what we do for the community. And when you volunteer for a group like this, you don't have to bring anything with you, because most of the people, there are only 2 people in the group at present that have any kind of a science background. And the rest of the individuals bring their life experience, their intelligence, and their imagination. And that's what it takes to keep a group like this running. So, I think there was a sign-up sheet, actually, that will go around. Sarah, do we have the sign-up sheet? Okay, it's in the back of the room. Sarah has it. So thanks to you, and I think we can go on. Okay? Liz?
All right. Hi, everyone. I guess this is a little unfair. I didn't tell you how to pronounce my name, but my name is Liv Woods. I'm the executive director at Mass Oyster Project.
Give the mic, please. Give the mic, please.
The mic. The scary mic. So, hi, everybody. My name is Liv Woods. I'm the executive director of Mass Oyster Project. And I'm excited to be here tonight. My goal for this conversation, and I'm assuming you can all hear me now because you're not telling me otherwise. Thumbs up? Yes, great. Okay, so my goal for this conversation is to not only tell you about Mass Oyster, but to talk about oysters a little bit, tell you why you might want to care about oysters, and give you a sense of what you can do with oysters and Mass Oyster Project after this talk. So who are we? We are a nonprofit. We are working to strengthen our coastal environment by restoring oysters. So I usually tell folks, you know, who is Mass Oyster Project? We use oysters as our vehicle for restoration work. We have a big volunteer base, and we use that base to engage with communities for our work. So I will let John introduce himself a little bit more when he speaks, but I'm going to tell you more about Mass Oyster Project, and John will talk more about the ocean acidification piece. But as you can see here, John has lots of experience. Oh, yeah, that works well. Thank you. Lots of experience as a professor, and now in his retirement is helping us out at Mass Oyster Project as the vice chair. Like I said, my name's Lee Woods. I have actually been with the organization for almost 2 years. The organization has operated since 2008, but I was the first executive director to be hired. I do not come from this area, but I come from a place that has over 20 years of healthcare experience, working in for-profit, nonprofit. I have a bunch of experience working on some boards, as you can see here. And beyond just having a consulting background and a business background, I come with a ton of passion for this work, and also just a love of the ocean, and I call myself an environmentalist. I find every opportunity to recycle anything and everything in my house, and just absolutely get totally kick out of having one bag of garbage going out in the week. I think that's like a huge win in my house, given that there's 5 of us. These are some pictures, and this is what Mass Oyster is all about. I'll tell you a little bit more about each of these, but as you can see here, we've got buckets with people from our shell recycling program. We have some pictures of a culture project that we did, and I'll tell you more about these things, but we also actually, the pictures in the top right-hand side, those are from the Mill River, where we planted oysters for the last couple of years from some of our upwellers. So like I said, why is it oysters? Oysters are great filter feeders. They help create reefs, they protect the coastline, and they maintain ecosystems. This is a really cool visual because it talks about the importance of oysters, but it gives kind of 3 different levels. You've got the provisioning services, the regulating services, and the cultural services. So oysters increase water clarity, they help increase fish production, they increase oyster populations, of course. They have a really strong cultural value. There's lots of towns where, if you think about Wellfleet, it's been part of the Wellfleet history for hundreds of years. They improve water quality. They stabilize sediment areas, denitrification, and they enhance biodiversity. So oysters play a huge role in our ecosystems. They are fundamental for our ecosystems. Among shellfish, they do this, they filter, they clean the water, they do it better than some of the other shellfish. So that's a question I get asked often is, why oysters over clams or mussels or razor clams, that sort of thing. They do a really good job at it, so why now? So why is this so important now? This is kind of a new slide that I put in here because I think it's really important to kind of highlight why is this important now, and especially why is this important in Massachusetts. So historically, Massachusetts has not supported oyster restoration or any sort of restoration in this space. 20 plus years, Massachusetts has said, no, not for us, we're not going to do this. If you go to any other states in Massachusetts that are connected to the water, they are doing this type of work. They are 30 years into this type of work. If anybody's heard of Chesapeake Bay, they have a 30-year-old program. Louisiana, Texas, Florida, every state up and down the eastern coast has oyster restoration going on, and Massachusetts is behind on this. However, there's been a huge shift. I have been part of this organization for almost 2 years, like I said, and during my very first phone calls with some state agencies, they said, yep, but we don't do that. And 2 years into it, I was just in the office with the Department of Marine Fisheries today for 2 hours, and the conversation literally went from, I know we said for 20 years we weren't doing this, but we're ready to do this. The tide is changing. So there's a lot of really great momentum in Massachusetts, and in particular, Massachusetts, so the Department of Marine Fisheries, they are who we kind of get guidance from and decides who and what we can do. They just hired their own habitat restoration manager. So they're serious about this work, and it's really cool. So I bring this picture up because I think it's a really good visual for you to see. This is Plum Island, right there. So that's what this is a water classification. So it shows where waters are open, where they're conditionally approved, and where they're closed. And one of the reasons that this is so important is because it kind of highlights where you're able to actually do recreational shellfishing, and it highlights where you're not allowed to do recreational shellfishing. It also highlights, so right now, we aren't able to put our shellfish. So the oysters filter water, right? You would think we want to go put those oysters in the dirtiest water so they can clean the water and they can provide habitat and help improve the water quality. At the moment, we're not allowed to do that. So we're only allowed to plant our oysters in these green approved areas. That's changing. So what do? We engage with volunteers around Massachusetts. We grow oysters in upwellers, which I'll show you a picture in a second of what our upwellers look like. We have an established recycling program. So we are coming up on our 4th year of shell recycling on the Cape. We work with about 25 restaurants on the Cape, and we take shell from restaurants, we recapture it, and once we've aged it for a year, we're able to reuse that shell for habitat restoration. We also partner with state government, nonprofits, for-profits, academic institutions. We're really big on education. I often say it's kind of like the heart of our organization because everything really starts with educating youth, educating community members, educating town members to really help people and communities see the impact and the importance of this type of work. I won't go into this, but our goal is to partner with public, private, nonprofit sectors so that we can all work together. I say this probably way too much with the folks that I work with, but at the end of the day, I think that if we have more partnerships and we are using each other to help each other move forward, we will get to a better place together. As a review from last year, so we have 7 upwellers. Like I said, I'll show you what an upweller looks like in a second. We have 25 participating restaurants. We collected over 3,000 buckets of shells last year. That equated to about 71,000 pounds of shell. That's roughly around somewhere plus or minus 6 tons of shell. It's a lot of shell. And we have one tax credit that's sitting right now, which we hopefully will get approved, which will give restaurants a tax credit for their shell recycling programs. Here's a picture of our upweller. If anybody's ever been to the Maritime Museum in Gloucester, this is an upweller. It's an oyster hatchery. We grow between 200 and 300,000 oysters up on the North Shore every summer, and then we put the oysters back into the water on the North Shore. So currently, this is actually not entirely updated, but we last year had an upweller in Marblehead, Manchester, Gloucester, 2 on Nantucket, and 1 in Hyannis, and 1 in Yarmouth. We are in the process of actually, hopefully, if we get approval tomorrow night, putting an upweller in Newburyport this spring. So we're super excited about that. So where would we like to go on the North Shore? So we would love to expand our opportunities to engage with towns. At the end of the day, it's the town that really decides that they want to do this work. And once the town is kind of on board with this type of work, we work with the towns to help advise and establish the programs that we already have, and to help towns navigate doing projects that would relate to, like, the oysters or restoration. We would love to establish a North Shore shell recycling program. I think Newburyport would be an amazing hub to have. You've got, I think, a few restaurants who might be shucking oysters, and I think it would be a great opportunity to have not only an upweller in town where you're growing oysters, but you're also working with local restaurants, capturing the shell, and then together you can have the oysters and the shell. All right, I'm going to pass it over to John.
Hello, hello everyone. So as a marine conservation scientist, it's kind of my job to start off with bad news. But I want to let you know there is hope. I will always tell my students when I would teach my conservation biology class that I will depress the hell out of you for the first 8 weeks, and then the last 4 weeks is all about hope. So there is hope, and a big part of the hope is oyster reef restoration. So as you know, I'm going to talk about acidification. Usually we refer to as ocean acidification, but there's a difference between ocean and coastal acidification that's really important, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But first, let's talk about acidification. So acidification is often called the other carbon problem because it has the same root cause of that global warming has, which of course leads to global climate change. And this is the excess CO2 we're pumping into the atmosphere from the burning of fossil fuels and other sources, but primarily the burning of fossil fuels. And as a scientist, I have to put up graphs. It's in my contract. So when you look on the right side, you can see the top graph showing the increase in atmospheric CO2 from around 1960 to around 2010. This is an old graph, but this is one of the ones you always see because it's really good data. So CO2 in parts per million is increasing over time. Look at the bottom graph on the right side. If you look at the blue squiggly lines, that's an increase in CO2 in the ocean. The green and black squiggly lines below it shows you a decrease in pH. And the graph on the left shows a decrease in pH from 1985 to 2020. So if you don't remember your pH scale, there's neutral pH, which is 7, which is what drinking water is. Anything above that is basic or alkaline. Anything below it is acidic. Now, the oceans are not going to become acid, but the pH is declining, and that's what we mean by acidification, right? And we'll talk a little bit about the cause of that and the effect of that. But again, the oceans are not becoming a vat of acid, right? It's just the pH is declining. And one other thing to notice is you see on the graph on the left, it goes from 8.11 down to around 8.05. You may say that's not a big change. but every 0.1 change in the pH scale is a 30% increase in acidification. It's because it's a logarithmic scale. So the changes are not as great as you would see in a linear scale. So what is the cause of acidification? And I'm not a chemist, and so I don't expect anyone else to understand this. But the point that I want to make from this slide is that we have CO2 dissolving into seawater. About 30% of the excess CO2 we put in the atmosphere gets absorbed in seawater. This causes a chemical reaction. CO2 plus H2O, water, produces carbonic acid, which then dissociates or breaks apart into free hydrogen ions. That's the H plus bicarbonate, and then you see this reaction at the bottom that is hydrogen plus carbonate causes bicarbonate. Why is this important? Well, there's two parts of this that's really important. You don't need to understand the chemical reaction, you just need to understand this. And I have those yellow kind of arrows pointing to the two parts that's most important. The free hydrogen ions, the H+, that is what causes the pH to decline. pH is actually a measure of free hydrogen ions in solution. The more CO2 we pump into the atmosphere, the more CO2 goes into the ocean, the more H+s we produce. That reduces the pH. That leads to acidification. But what also is happening is that on the bottom part where you see carbonate, carbonate is an important compound that is used by organisms like clams, oysters, reef-building corals in building the shells in the skeleton. Well, when you have hydrogen combining with carbonate to produce bicarbonate, it takes carbonate out of the ocean. That carbonate is no longer available for those, what we call calcifiers. And that leads to some issues that I'll talk about in a minute, okay? But what is the difference between ocean and coastal acidification? And for the North Shore, we're most concerned about coastal acidification. Ocean acidification pretty much refers to the open ocean. CO2 goes into seawater, produces that chemical reaction, pH goes down, carbonate becomes scarce. In coastal acidification, we have other things that lead to the lowering of pH and the loss of carbonate ions. So excess nutrients, runoff nitrogen from fertilizers running off of golf courses and lawns, or leaky cesspools putting nutrients into seawater causes plankton blooms. Well, the plankton blooms eventually die. They decompose. That releases CO2 in the decomposition process. It also consumes oxygen, which leads to dead oxygen or hypoxic dead zones. A lot of river water is acidic. That causes pH when it goes into the ocean. Along the coast, it reduces the pH even further. Freshwater input, there's a lot of fresh water dumping into the Gulf of Maine. I do my research up in Maine in Acadia National Park. The coast of Maine is just river after river after river input. That fresh water dilutes the salinity. A reduction of salinity reduces the buffering capacity of seawater. Which means that it can change in pH more easily when the buffering capacity gets reduced. And then not so much here, but certainly on the west coast of the United States and the west coast of other coastal areas, you get an upwelling of deep water coming to the surface. Often that deep water has high concentrations of CO2, which can also add to coastal acidification. So ocean acidification is a problem. Coastal acidification can even be worse because of all these other factors that can lead to the decline in pH. And often, these other factors are actually more important, more significant than the actual amount of CO2 from the atmosphere that's going into the ocean. So why should we worry about ocean and coastal acidification? I've already mentioned this a little bit, but there's a couple of major issues that occur with these so-called calcifiers. So first, a reduction in pH and lower carbonate levels can cause calcium carbonate, the shells that make up our soft shell clams, our oysters, can cause them to dissolve. We call that dissolution. Also, with the reduced availability of carbonate ions, it reduces the ability of these organisms to build new shell, to repair the shells. Obviously, that is an issue. The shells are dissolving, and these organisms are having a harder time to repair their shells. Ultimately, this affects survival and reproduction of these organisms. Right? This is a very used photograph from NOAA showing this tiny little mollusk. It's a tiny little snail called sea butterfly or pteropod. The shell was put under conditions of pH and carbonate saturation levels, the amount of carbonate ions, in seawater, 0, 15, 30, and 45 days, and within 45 days, the shell was almost dissolved away. So this is the issue with calcifiers with acidification, whether it's coastal or ocean acidification. So what is the effect of acidification on oysters? So here's a couple of graphs, a study done on eastern oysters, looking at larval survival. The larval stage of these organisms tend to be, often are the most sensitive stage to acidification. So most marine organisms have a larval stage. The larvae hatch out of the egg. Often they go into the plankton. They float in the plankton for days to weeks to months, and then they settle out. During that larval stage, when they're in the plankton, they're very vulnerable to acidification. So here's looking at larval survival. This was a laboratory study, a laboratory and field study. And what you really just need to get from this, and the graph on the right is probably the clearer of the two to look at. The black line is a pH of 7.8, which is still a little bit low. The green line on the bottom is pH of 7.2. The age is on the bottom, or the x-axis, 0, 2, 4, 6 days of age. So these are very young larvae. The fact that the green line is below the black line tells you that survival was much lower and significantly lower than at 7.8. So in this study, it showed clearly that that very young oyster larvae don't survive very well at low pH. Here's part of the same study looking at growth. And again, the black line on the top is 7.8. This case, the bottom line on the left, kind of the margarita green line, is 7.0, very low pH. Again, very much below the black line. Shell length or shell growth was significantly affected by low pH. Same thing on this right graph. These were just two different field sites, but you still see the same effect. At low pH, the lower the pH, the less the oyster grew. So, and again, looking at larvae. What about adult effects on adults? This study looked at the regrowth of shells in adults, in adult oysters. The graph to the left, ambient PCO2. PCO2 is just a measure of the concentration of CO2 in seawater. So the kind of the purplish bars are ambient PCO2, and then elevated PCO2, which means lower pH, right? More CO2, the lower the pH. You can see how the red bars of the elevated PCO2, which shows shell regrowth at days post-hatching, the very young oysters again, 2, 4, 7, 11, 21 days of age. The ability to regrow shell was very much less, very much lower than under ambient or current CO2. Now, current CO2 is actually lower because the CO2 has been increasing since the Industrial Revolution. So when we talk about ambient CO2, current CO2, we have to also remember that that CO2 is higher and the pH is lower than the historical baseline. Right? So, and you can see the pictures on the left. It's hard to see, but they showing what it looked like, what shell regrowth would look like in these oysters. So adults could not regrow a damaged shell, or at least it was affected by the amount of CO2 and pH. Well, what about other organisms? It's not just the calcifiers. Fish are being affected, lobsters are being affected, and the way you read this graph along the top is, again, it's a very busy graph, but if you just look at the corals, the mollusks are clams, oysters, crustaceans, of course, are lobsters, echinoderms, sea urchins, and of course, fish. The red bar is, so this was looking at various studies and aggregating the studies that studied the effect of ocean acidification, pH, on these different groups. Going from left to right in each of those separate groups of bars goes from control to very high CO2 or very low pH. The height of the red bar indicates the number of studies that showed a negative effect on those organisms, whether it's growth, survival, reproduction, whatever they were studying. And as you can see, as you go from all the way on the left, which is control, to all the way to the right, you see the bars get higher, the red bars get taller and taller. So it shows you that with greater concentrations of CO2, again, lower pH, the effects, we saw there was more and more effects, or studies showing effects on negative effects on these organisms. So from corals all the way to fish, no one gets a free pass in the ocean when it comes to acidification. And then ultimately, of course, we have to worry about the ripple effect, which is known as the extinction cascade, right? This is a beautiful figure from the Billion Oyster Project, showing eastern oysters in the middle and showing the connectedness of the food web that includes these oysters. And the way you read a food web is that the arrows point in the way that energy moves. So it goes from prey to predator. So you see, like algae, the arrows point to the eastern oysters because eastern oysters eat algae. But if you follow the lines from the eastern oysters, like to the great egret, you see the organisms that rely on eastern oysters for food. Well, you pull out the eastern oysters from this food web, then the egrets lose a food source. The oyster toadfish loses a prey, a food source. You start pulling on this thread. It's often, the food webs are often kind of referred to like a tapestry. Pull a few threads and the tapestry is fine. Keep pulling threads and eventually the tapestry falls apart. So the eastern oysters are an integral part of this food web, right? We lose the eastern oysters, we'll start to see rippling effects throughout. We could see rippling effects throughout the food web. So the Gulf of Maine. You all know where the Gulf of Maine is. Just walk out to your favorite beach and look at the water, and you're looking at the Gulf of Maine, right? But what's really important about the Gulf of Maine when we talk about acidification, unfortunately, this is kind of, from a scientific point of view, kind of the perfect natural laboratory to study coastal and ocean acidification. The Gulf of Maine acidification is affecting the Gulf of Maine at a higher rate than most of the rest of the world's oceans. And the Gulf of Maine is warming more quickly than 99% of the world's oceans, right? This, my research is on ocean acidification and warming, how it affects intertidal organisms and communities. And I chose Acadia National Park partly because it's my favorite place on Earth, but also because, unfortunately, it's the perfect place to study ocean acidification and warming because it's right in the middle of the Gulf of Maine. So here is looking at the Gulf of Maine from it's more than the Gulf of Maine because it goes from Long Island, New York, where I grew up, all the way up to Bay of Fundy, Newfoundland. And this heat map, this color-coded heat map, shows what's known as aragonite saturation state. Aragonite is the carbonate, the calcium carbonate that is primarily used by mollusks like clams and oysters. As I put on the top, when it falls below 3, organisms become stressed. When saturation state is less than well, shells and other structures begin to dissolve and repair becomes difficult. Well, you can see the color, the yellow. One is the yellow color. Anything below 1 into the reds, really bad news. But the blues aren't good news either. It's below 3. These organisms are stressed. And you can see throughout the Gulf of Maine, we see blues, reds, and yellows, which tells us that the aragonite saturation is well below 3 and where it should be. So these organisms are being stressed. These organisms are not surviving and reproducing as well. I mean, we can measure and monitor the changes in pH and saturation state in real time, and both are going in the wrong direction. So we have a lot of oyster farms in Massachusetts. And so a lot of this study was done in the Pacific Northwest, where the alarm bells went off very early about the effect of acidification on oyster farms. The Pacific Northwest also have that coastal upwelling. So with all of the other stuff that goes on along the coast, they get this CO2-rich, these low pH-rich waters coming up and bathing the coast. Well, a study was done looking at what it would take to have a high enough, or what should be the aragonite threshold, saturation threshold, for having larval production that's high enough, so looking at a larval survival rate, to support oyster farms. And that came out to be a aragonite concentration of 1.8. In many places along the Pacific Northwest where they have oyster farms, the saturation state is below 1.8. So all of those dots, those white circles within the red dotted line, are oyster farms that had waters where the aragonite concentrations were not high enough to support survivorship of larvae at a rate that would self-sustain the oyster farms. Even though if it's greater than 1, you can get proper development of larvae, 1.7, I kept saying 1.8, I meant 1.7, is needed to produce enough larvae to self-sustain the oyster farms. And here's just a look at what it looks like. On the left is oysters, larval oysters raised under pH of 8, which is a good pH. And on the right, a pH of around 7.5. And you can just see where the yellow arrows are. You can see the deformity of the shells. So this is happening at a very early age. The oysters are not being able to produce proper shells and repair their shells. I can't, even though this is a bit outside of the topic of the talk, you can't talk about acidification in the Gulf of Maine without warming. So when you look at this graph, the solid blue, so this goes from 1980 to around 2020. The gray lines in the background is just all of the data points. The solid blue line and the dotted line are the averages. The dotted green line is the increase in average temperature, ocean temperature globally over that time. The solid blue line is the average increase in temperature in the Gulf of Maine. And you can see how much greater it is. And because the line is steeper, the rate is higher. And you can see how much faster the Gulf of Maine is warming compared to the global average. It's not good for the global oceans either. The temperature is increasing, but the Gulf of Maine is increasing at even a higher rate. So what can we do to help protect the oysters? So this is kind of the good news or the hopeful part of the lecture. We still have some time left. There are still strategies we can do to help the oysters. Then I'll talk about how the oysters can help everything else. So again, with all of the oyster farms that we have, I figured I'd start off with this slide, looking at how raising kelp in oyster farms can help that particular oyster farms. This effect, it tends to be fairly local, fairly on a small scale, but certainly on the scale of oyster farms. Looking at the bars on the bottom, don't worry about the squiggly lines on top. We have outside of, when kelp is outside of an oyster farm, the oyster farm is in the kelp, and looking at the conditions near the kelp. And you can see that the bars are highest on all 3 graphs for inside kelp. So when measurements were taken inside the kelp, we saw that the saturation rate was higher. That's the top where the 2 bars are. Again, that's the concentration of the right type of carbonate that's needed for oysters. Growth of the oysters the shell-based growth of oysters was significantly higher inside of kelp. And tissue-based growth, the actual animal, the body of the animal growth rate was higher inside kelp. And this was partly due to the kelp, because kelp takes up CO2 in photosynthesis like green plants do. It took CO2 out of the seawater and actually raised the pH, which allowed the aragonite levels to rise. So what else can we do? I know this is a very busy slide, but again, I wanted to show you that there's lots of things that we can still do to help protect oysters. Of course, the number 1 bullet is let's just stop burning fossil fuels, right? Let's just, that's going to happen anytime soon, right? That is the best thing we can do. Let's stop pumping the CO2 in the atmosphere and then into the ocean. Of course, even if we stopped today and went to carbon neutral, the lag time, the oceans will still continue to warm, pH will still continue to decrease for a while. But this, of course, it's ultimately the best thing we can do. If we can't do that, we can restore biodiversity, increase biodiversity, restore biodiversities of marine ecosystems and terrestrial ecosystems. A more diverse food web has redundancy in it so that there's more threads you can pull before the tapestry falls apart. So let's protect what we can protect and increase or at least maintain biodiversity in marine systems. Especially SAV, or submerged of aquatic vegetation like seaweeds and seagrasses, which take CO2 out of seawater. We can reduce the other stressors on oysters, and I had a slide on the other stresses, but it was even more packed than this. There's other stressors on oysters. If we can reduce those stressors, the oysters wouldn't be as stressed, and they wouldn't be as affected by acidification. We can monitor seawater chemistry better. And this way we can have an early warning system for oyster farmers, because in the Pacific Northwest, a lot of farms treat the water that they're bringing in to their oyster farms, because a lot of times the oysters are raised in tanks on land. They treat the water before it comes in, or they just let water in when the CO2 levels are within an appropriate range. So if we monitor seawater, we can increase the productivity of oyster farms and oyster hatcheries as well, of course. We can selectively breed oysters that are less sensitive to acidification. Like many traits in organisms, there's a range. Some individuals within a species are more sensitive than other individuals. So if we can identify those individuals that are less sensitive to acidification, then we can breed them. It's just like breeding cattle for greater meat production or milk production. You can do breeding. Corals are being bred in a way to produce corals that are less sensitive to ocean warming and bleaching. We can do the same thing with oysters. This one scares me a little bit. Woods Hole is actually doing a study on this, looking at alkalinity enhancement, dumping sodium hydroxide, lye, into the ocean. That will increase alkalinity, increases the ability of the oceans to store CO2. I have great faith in the Woods Hole, but it still scares me. This is known as geoengineering, but we may be at the point where we need to start really seriously considering, unfortunately, geoengineering. One thing we do know is we're at the point where we need to start taking carbon out of the atmosphere, and we need to start taking carbon out of the ocean. Better to do it naturally, restoring seagrass beds, restoring forests, but we may be at the point where we need to do some geoengineering. Then, of course, education, outreach. I'm a big fan of citizen science. All of my fieldwork is done with volunteers. It gets the public involved in scientific research. They learn about the issues. They become empowered. They're the best ambassadors for environmental change. But of course, education and outreach is a big part of the mission of Mass Oyster Project. So getting the word out, making people understand not only what the issues are, but what the solutions are. And then lastly, for me anyway, how can oysters help the rest of the ecosystems? Well, it increases, as Lee said, great filtration. These are great filtration devices. They will eat the phytoplankton, which reduces the amount of phytoplankton along the coast that will die, decompose, and lead to coastal acidification. Could reduce acidification through the dissolution of old oyster shells. Oyster reefs are built on top of dead shells. And older reefs have more dead shells than young reefs. There's some evidence, more study is needed, but some evidence that the dissolution of these old shells can, at least in a small area, reduce the pH in that area. Of course, if you do it on the scale that they're doing in the Chesapeake, it will have a greater effect. So that's one way that oyster reefs can help the environment. Increase habitat for macroalgae, seaweed. Grow seaweed, take CO2 out of seawater, reduces the pH. And again, as I mentioned earlier, if we increase and maintain biodiversity, the oyster reefs do that by being habitat for many other organisms, increase the biodiversity of marine ecosystems, increase the resiliency of marine ecosystems. Okay. And I will now turn this over to Lee, who will tell you how all of you can get involved if you're interested. Okay, sure.
So this is our last slide, and we are happy to answer questions after this, but I wanted to kind of bring this all back to the North Shore and highlight some really cool stuff that is happening with Mass Oyster, especially on the North Shore. And hopefully after all of that, you can look at this and have some positive vibes going on and thinking, I actually can do something about this. So like I said, we are in discussion with Newburyport for installing an oyster upweller this spring. If that all goes according to plan, we will need volunteers to come help us clean the upweller and participate in raising those oysters with us. We have, like I said, a couple other upwellers. We have Manchester and Gloucester. You can go visit the upwellers typically on any given day. We actually have Carrie over here, our Manchester upweller lead. The volunteers are at the upwellers, they're cleaning them. If you see the tops off the upwellers, go check them out. The volunteers are happy to scoop the oysters out, show you the oysters, talk to you about the oysters. We have a really cool volunteer network who wants to help share their information. We have a shell recycling kickoff on May 5th. It's down in Wellfleet, if any of you are Cape Codders also. I've got some great representation here tonight. So I've got Brendan here from Great Marsh. We actually have oysters overwintering in his farm right now. And we will be hopefully spreading those oysters during a volunteer event. So we will be sending those oysters on their way this spring. We also have, so I saw a friend in the back over there. We have done for the last, I guess we're on 3 years or 5 years. Yes, 5 years. We have been part of the Newburyport Oyster Festival. If anybody has gone to the Oyster Festival, we have actually been recycling those shells. Every year we take them down to our aging site. And so that event, I can't remember how many oysters you're shucking during that event, but we are literally filling, I think, 5 or 6 barrels full of shells and being able to, what'd you say?
About 10 to 12,000 oysters.
Yeah, so there's a ton of oysters shucked there, and on one day, we are able to take all of those shells, and instead of it going into the trash, going into your dump, we are able to repurpose those shells and take them and use them again. And that to me is like such a huge win. Avoid the landfill and go for the ocean. Come on, right? We also have a really fun event October 4th. We will have our 5th annual Give a Shuck. We do this to benefit Mass Oyster Project. It's down in Boston at Community Rowing. We have 250 people. We invite, Brendan came last year. We had farmers shucking their oysters, and we had Boston chefs creating little like delights for folks to try. It was a really fun event. And then, like I said, what we will do is we will grow oysters starting in July in the 3 upwellers on the North Shore. And typically what we do at the end of the season is we go plant the oysters, kind of like what we'll be doing in the springtime. So we'll have 2 opportunities. I would also just say, like, check our website out. We have a couple of volunteer opportunities coming up that are a little bit not so fleshed out yet, but opportunities to help us go identify where oyster reefs, where there are currently oysters already growing naturally up on the North Shore. We're really curious about that. And we're very curious about the history of oysters and where they have been up on the North Shore. So anybody with kind of historical information, we'd love to talk with you and understand what was previously around before all the overharvesting and pollution kind of killed oysters off up here. And I guess that's about it. We'd love to answer any questions if folks have them. I'm just looking. Yep, yeah, look at that.
Can you explain that a little more about recycling?
So the question was if we could just talk a little bit more about the oyster recycling program. So the oyster recycling program, like I said, right now it's in its 3rd or 4th year. We started it on the Cape because we had a lot of success there. We work with the restaurants. We provide them buckets, and the restaurants basically have buckets where their shuckers are shucking, and the wait staff also has a bucket to put shells in. We then collect the buckets on a weekly basis with the restaurants. So this is a free program to restaurants. All we need is for a restaurant who is interested in working with us to engage with us, and then we provide the service, because at the end of the day, we're looking to, reuse that shell and recapture that shell instead of it going into the waste stream. So we take the buckets, we take them to an aging site, and Massachusetts law requires us to age it for 1 year. It's my way, usually what I tell people, it's nature's way of washing, drying, and rinsing it. After that, the shell is pretty bleached out, and any bacteria has been eaten off. Birds, animals, insects have come and kind of cleaned the shells out for us, and then the shell is ready to kind of be used for projects down the road.
What kind of projects do they?
So that, oyster restoration projects. So there's a handful of things that you can do with the shell. You can actually do a process called spat on shell, where you actually take the shells and you put them in a pool, you put oyster larvae in, and the oyster larvae will naturally set onto the shells. And so then you can kind of take that, we call them culch bags. You can take the culch bags and kind of put them back into an area that's been pre-approved and permitted with DMF to help more oysters regenerate in those areas. Hopefully that's a good way. Fred?
You answered it.
Okay. Go ahead.
Could you talk a little bit about why you're not allowed, or there are regulations that prevent oyster seeding in the red zones that seem to need it the most?
Sure. Yeah, so the question is, why can't we plant oysters in prohibited areas? So like I said, this is a policy. This is a policy that DMF put into place about 20 years ago. It was a bit of a, if we don't put oysters in the water, Joe Schmo can't walk down this beach, pick up the oyster, it has bacteria in it, that person gets sick and then goes and tells as many people as they can. So it was a way to protect the public from eating dirty oysters and getting sick. So if we don't put oysters there, they won't be able to pick them up, they won't get sick. Go ahead.
So I think you need to maybe explain a little bit of how an upweller works.
Sure.
Newburyport had an upweller, say at Cashman Park, I think is where it might be discussed. What would happen to oysters that were raised in that upweller? Where would they go?
Sure, that's, yeah. Carrie's probably smiling. She's like, that's the question I get asked every single time. So at the moment, Oh, so the question is, where are the oysters going to go if we put an upweller into Newburyport? For 2025, most likely they will go into a pre-approved area that we have already determined with DMF. There's a handful of towns that we're currently working with, including Gloucester, Ipswich, Rowley. Is that everybody that I'm thinking?
North Shore.
On the North Shore. I think those are about the 3 or 4 towns that we're working with right now who have open areas, so open water, that also has a town who's willing to work with us and interested in planting our oysters. So at the moment, that's kind of the 2025 plan, is to plant the seeds in a town that is interested in working with us, has open water, and will approve us for planting them. Going into 2026, and this is kind of, this is kind of fresh off the press, we are going to be working with DMF to be identifying a plan to be able to put oysters back into prohibited waters. And the goal would be, if there is a town that has an upweller, the goal would be to put the oysters back into that town's water. But right now, we haven't been able to do that because not every town actually that we're working with has open water. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Well, I guess, again, back, can you just explain for folks who've never seen an upweller, what is it? How does it work? Is it a machine? Is it a bunch of buckets?
Yes.
How does an oyster grow?
So hopefully you can see this picture well enough. It looks like a really ugly box from the outside, but what is on the inside is those buckets have mesh lining underneath. So when we get our spat, so this upweller hosts, I think this upweller is like 60 to 80,000 oyster seeds that we purchased to go in it at the beginning of the season. They'll be as tiny as like your fingernail. And what we do is the mesh is super, it's very small holes in the mesh. And oysters, we will put like between 10 and 20,000 oysters in each of those buckets. And there's gonna be 12 buckets. So you'll have 2 lines of 6 oysters, 2 lines of 6 buckets. And what will happen is the bucket has that little hole, and each of those pipes at the end, there's like a little white piece on there, that gets connected to a center trough. And so what happens is the upweller, the tank, has a intake pump, and the pump pulls water into the upweller. It then kind of siphons along the upweller, and the oysters feed off of it, and then it's got an outtake pump. And so essentially, when the upweller is in the town and it is and it's running, it is actually cleaning that water, but the oysters are not getting swept away. They're kind of in these little silos that provide them a place to feed off the water, but not get sucked out and destroyed. Does that answer your question? Wish I had another better.
May I ask a follow-up on that?
Yes.
Brackish water, does that affect the ability to do this?
Yes, but I don't think they're not in a place where most of these upwellers are in harbors where you're not dealing with like different brackish water spaces.
Where in Newburyport are you talking to?
So right in front of the Harbor Masters building. So the question was, where are we talking about putting the oyster, the upweller in Newburyport, and it's in front of the Harbor Masters building. I think there was another question. Go ahead. Yes.
Is the pH of the water there suitable for these small growing oysters?
I think it would be. Oh, sorry. The question is if the pH would be suitable for growing these oysters. That's a great question. I mean, we're not actively testing it. So what we will do is we will test the water once in the upweller. But that's a great question. We haven't actually looked at what the pH is in the Newburyport in the harbor, but I'm guessing like it's most of the other upweller situations. It's probably perfectly fine, and we haven't had any issues growing any of our oysters so far up on the North Shore. Besides the water being a little bit colder, they're slower to grow, but I don't think that that's been a problem. You want to follow up? Go ahead.
Oh, the other question was, I'm not quite sure I understand. Usually when I see oysters, or we see oysters, they're in farms, and they're, they bring them up and they see how they're doing. Are you saying that you just bring these buckets out and dump them into areas that are like that, green, and just dump them into sand or whatever's on the bottom?
Right. So the question is sort of like, how do we end up seeding the oysters after we grow them? So we are only allowed to grow oysters up to about 25 millimeters. So that's about a little less than an inch or so. That is because we are not growing oysters for to be sold, or that's to kind of protect them from being for the possibility that they could be sold and then eaten. What you see in this bucket is kind of like us doing a seeding here. We just do we call it broadcast seeding. It's literally just like tossing them, because what will happen is they will set. We'll never plant the oysters in mud. We'll put them in, typically a favorable place where we already know oysters will survive. And they will kind of set themselves, and then they will, while they're not like clustering here now, they will kind of naturally find spaces together to cluster and grow and survive. Did I answer that well enough? Yeah, go ahead.
So would you share what the most important factors are for a community to be a collaborator with the program?
Great question. So what are the most important factors for a community to be a collaborator? I would say, what we have found is when towns and communities come to us first, that is like the number one sign that we will have success. When we go to towns and we tell them what we think they should do, it doesn't usually go so well. So typically we wait for towns to come to us and engage with us, because what that means is there are community members who have a desire to do something positive, and a commitment, and the energy to work with us and their town officials to help something be moved forward. Yeah, go ahead.
So who in the town would you say comes to you? The officials, who is it?
So who in the town comes to us? We have had everything from just community members calling us up and saying, I'm concerned. So residents, community, kids, just generally people who are concerned contact to us. And then we've had experiences where the shellfish constable, or also known as the harbor master, has reached out to us to say, I know about your program, and it's something I'd like to do in my town also.
What support do you need in Newburyport?
That's a great question. It's like I planted it. It's amazing. So what support do we need in Newburyport? Honestly, so we have another example of another town that we started working with over a year ago in Yarmouth. They reached out to us. They said they wanted to do an upweller. And so what support do we need? A town that wants to come and do like the full circle, the full life cycle of an oyster. And to me, that is a town that wants to do the upweller program, but also really enthusiastic about the shell recycling program. And so when the town of Yarmouth reached out to us to say, hey, can we put an upweller in our town? And I want to put it right here in the Bass River, which is 5 feet away. I was like, great. And hey, by the way, how do you feel about shell recycling? And they were like, we are on it. And so I find that when there's a town who wants to do like the whole story, that is really, that to me has the biggest impact, because to be able to tell the whole full story of an oyster going from larvae to seed to being planted, and then potentially, not that oyster, but another oyster going to a restaurant, being shucked, and then the shell goes into a bucket, gets reused, and then eventually that shell goes back in the water to be habitat for more oysters going on. Like, to me, that is a really great, compelling story that everybody can say, I know where I can play a role in this, whether you're eating the oysters at the restaurant, or you're supporting a restaurant that does shell recycling, or you're helping to clean the upweller. I think that, to me, is a place where everybody can find their spot to be part of. Go for it.
So then, before someone comes to you, they might have a venue or a site in mind to start the oysters. Can you give us some parameters or describe what that might look like in terms of salinity, what type of bottom there is, what are the tides doing, what are adjacent vegetations? What does that place look like?
Do you want to take that? Sure. You got to repeat the question.
So if I understood the question, you're asking about what would be a good site for restoring a reef? Is that correct? Or a good site for upwellers?
What's a good site to plant oysters?
To plant oysters. Well, the bottom is really important. Oysters need a hard bottom. Now, we can get around that by putting down substrate, certainly putting down shell, or there's these other things called oyster pyramids and reef balls, and so there's ways around it. So if it's a muddy bottom and we don't do anything to help the oysters, they probably would not survive. They would just get filled with mud or sand and die. So if we're not going to do any changes to the substrate, rocky bottom is what we would need. We would need something ideally subtidal below the intertidal zone, at least for the reef to begin. Because if it's in deeper water, there's several advantages to that. One, they won't be harvested. If they're intertidal, we had this problem with Mill River in Gloucester where they were intertidal and folks would come by and harvest the oysters that we seeded. And that obviously is no way to restore an oyster reef. So subtidally would be ideal because, again, it keeps the casual walker from harvesting oysters. It also protects them until the reef gets larger and the oysters get older from being out of the water during the winter. When they will survive out of the water, but to give them a good start, we would want them to be subtidal. An area that has a good flow of water would be good because it will bring in oxygen, it will bring in food. But we don't want anything where the tidal exchange is so great, you get such fast-moving currents that it will scour the bottom or scour the oysters. So, rocky bottom, subtidal at least to begin with, good flow of water to bring in oxygen and food would be a good start. Again, if we wanted to restore oysters in a muddy area that formerly had oysters and the bottom has changed now and is muddy, again, we could put substrate down to give the oysters a chance to grow, and then they become the substrate for the next generation and the next generation of oysters.
I think you're describing all of the rocky jetties and groins and dikes that we have all around Plum Island. And maybe that's something to follow up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it certainly would. Growing them on the sides of the jetties and the groins would certainly. It's certainly good habitat for oysters, definitely. And that is similar to what a lot of organizations are doing with what's called living seawalls. where they have cement structures, where they have all these nooks and crannies for different organisms to settle on and to grow on, and it's a living seawall. A groin would be kind of a head start. We wouldn't have to put in an artificial wall to start growing the oysters on. Yeah.
The Merrimack River is well known for its combined sewage overflows, where when you have a storm, they overwhelm the treatment plants, and then we get a mess coming downriver. There's a lot of that, and the mess is measured in millions of gallons every storm. So what impact, would that have an impact on your plans for Newburyport, either to install this upwelling facility or even to create some reefs in this neighborhood?
And so the question was about sewage outflow into rivers and how that would affect the oysters, either to restore reefs or to set up the upwellers. My guess is that if the water is dirty enough, it will kill the oysters, and it wouldn't be a good location to plant oysters. It certainly wouldn't be a good location for upwellers to pull the water into the upwellers. How dirty does the water have to be before it starts killing off oysters? I don't know. But that certainly would be something that would have to be considered. How much of the contamination occurs, how often it occurs, and when it does occur, how bad it is. But that's something I think is an open question we would need to look into. I can't give you exact measurements, but I'm sure there's a point where it would just be too much sewage for the oysters.
Is it considered for your plan for behind the harbor master's house?
I'm sorry?
Has that issue been considered in your decision to put a upwelling plant behind the harbor master's house?
No, not as right now. I know there's been some other projects that have talked about putting, so now down in New Bedford, there's also a sewage plant, and there has been some talks down in New Bedford about actually kind of piloting around an area of a sewage output to see, what survives and what doesn't survive, and if it can make an impact on it. But as far as like Newburyport, we've had 2 conversations with Paul, and then kind of just going to the next phase of talking to a larger group tomorrow night at his commission meeting.
Yes.
You mentioned that the Gulf of Maine was the warmest, warming faster than other bodies of water, but you didn't give us a reason for that.
Sure. So the question is, why is the Gulf of Maine warming so quickly? Without going into too much scientific jargon, some of it I'm not even sure what it means, but basically the Gulf of Maine, there's two major ocean currents that come into the Gulf of Maine. The Labrador Current from the north, which is a cold water current, and the Gulf Stream that comes from the south, which is a warm water current. Because of ocean warming and because land-based ice, like glaciers, are melting, dumping fresh water into the North Atlantic, which is reducing the salinity, it's affecting how those two currents affect the Gulf of Maine. Normally, the two currents would kind of collide in the Gulf of Maine, and the Labrador Current would win. It would have a greater effect than the Gulf Stream. But because of all these changes that are occurring due to climate change and the warming oceans, the Gulf Stream now has a more significant impact on the Gulf of Maine. And that is causing the Gulf of Maine to warm up even more quickly than you would expect, just given the fact that the oceans are Yeah.
Is storm surge, or do you guys work with the Merrimack River Watershed Council at all?
I was going to suggest that as a contact because they have a, so you can repeat the question, but they have an automated measurement tool right out
Yeah.
in the Merrimack.
Yeah,
if you
yeah.
know that.
We've definitely started to have more partnerships and getting into the know of like who and what is going on. And they were brought up as a group. So I'm like in investigation mode with them.
I can put you in touch with John.
Great. Yeah. Great. I think given the time, we will wrap it up, but like I will not run out of here. So if you have more questions, I don't know if John will run out of here, but we are happy to answer any further questions, but we will let you all go if you are ready to call it a night. Thank you.